There was a time when becoming a famous guitarist seemed to require fitting into a familiar mold. Frank Zappa ignored that idea completely. He became known not because he followed the rules of rock music, but because he constantly questioned what those rules were supposed to be. His guitar playing, songwriting, arranging, and sharp musical imagination eventually made him one of the most distinctive figures in modern music. But how did an artist with such an unusual approach become so influential? And why did his work continue to change the way musicians thought about rock long after his biggest years on stage? The answer begins long before the famous records, with a young musician who was fascinated by sounds that most people around him barely noticed. Zappa's early musical interests were remarkably broad. He studied classical composers, became fascinated with orchestration, and listened closely to modern compositions alongside rhythm and blues and early rock. Instead of separating these styles, he began imagining what might happen if they were placed together. This became one of the defining ideas of his career. When Zappa formed the Mothers of Invention in the 1960s, the group quickly developed a reputation for doing things differently. Their music could move between complex arrangements, unusual rhythms, guitar passages, and carefully constructed performances. Zappa was not interested in making music predictable. He wanted every section to have a purpose. But that was only the beginning. As his reputation grew, Zappa became increasingly interested in the studio as another musical instrument. He treated recording like a laboratory, experimenting with arrangements, editing, sound design, and unusual combinations of instruments. For listeners discovering his work for the first time, it could feel like entering a completely different musical universe. His guitar playing was just as distinctive. Zappa was not always trying to make the guitar sound smooth or traditional. He explored unusual tones, sharp rhythmic ideas, and extended improvisations. His solos often sounded conversational, almost as if the instrument were responding to the musicians around him. Few people noticed how important this approach would become. Zappa also had an extraordinary ability to recognize talented musicians. Over the years, many skilled players passed through his bands, and several went on to establish their own successful careers. One of the most famous examples was Steve Vai, who worked with Zappa at a young age and gained an invaluable musical education through the experience. For Vai and others, playing with Zappa was about more than performing notes correctly. His arrangements demanded precision, concentration, and an ability to understand complicated musical ideas. That environment helped develop musicians who would later influence completely different parts of the rock and guitar world. What happened next changed Zappa's legacy even further. Instead of allowing himself to be defined only as a rock guitarist, he continued moving across musical boundaries. He created large-scale compositions, explored orchestral writing, worked with different ensembles, and continued developing his own approach to recording. This made his career difficult to place into a single category. Was he a rock musician? A composer? A guitarist? A band leader? In many ways, he was all of them at once. That refusal to fit neatly into one label became part of his influence. Zappa also believed strongly in musical independence. He wanted musicians to think for themselves and understand their instruments rather than simply copy whatever happened to be popular. His career became an example of how originality could become a strength rather than a limitation. Even today, his influence reaches beyond the musicians who directly work with him. Guitarists study his phrasing. Composers examine his arrangements. Producers look at his approach to the recording studio. And musicians continue to discover how much freedom can come from refusing to follow a predictable formula. The most interesting part of Frank Zappa's story is that his greatest achievement was not simply creating unusual music. It was expanding the idea of what rock music could contain. He showed that a guitar solo could exist beside complex composition. A rock band could operate with the precision of an ensemble. A recording studio could become part of the creative process. And a musician could build an entire career around curiosity rather than convention. That is why Zappa's legacy remains so difficult to summarize. He was never simply trying to become another famous guitarist. He was building his own musical language. And perhaps that is what truly changed everything. Frank Zappa proved that sometimes the most lasting contribution an artist can make is not giving the audience something familiar, but teaching them to hear familiar music in an entirely different way.